All right, there we go. All right, well, welcome everybody. We are really excited to have Thomas Hitoshi Pruiksma here today. And he is an author, translator, teacher, and performer. His translation of the classical Tamil masterpiece on ethics, power, and love, the Kural, was published to great acclaim by Beacon Press. Other books include The Safety of Edges, Give, Eat, and Live, and Body and Earth with artist C.F. John. He speaks and performs widely, mentors writers and translators one-on-one, teaches for the Cozy Grammar series of online video courses, and has received grants and fellowships from the National Endowment of the Arts for Culture, Artist Trust, and the U.S. Fulbright Program. Welcome, Thomas. We're very happy to have you.
Thank you, Julie. I'm very glad to be here. Thank you to you, and thank you to the King County Library System for giving me a chance to speak about this work, this masterpiece of world literature, which has been, for a variety of reasons, unduly neglected, we could say, and hasn't really yet entered into the English-speaking world in a way that, say, works like the Tao Te Ching or the poetry of Rumi, say, or and other works like that. Even though it is at the same sort of level of wisdom literature, I'm hoping that this new translation will help bring this really extraordinarily relevant work to more and more people. So I'm really glad to be here to speak about that. I have also been very glad to speak several times for the King County Library System on this work, sometimes about different aspects of it, sometimes more generally. And the last time I offered a presentation, one of the librarians suggested speaking about the third part of the book on love, because I had mentioned in a kind of offhand way that this is in a work that has been somewhat underserved. This particular part of the book, the third part of the book on love, has been often overlooked. And she was intrigued by that, and I am very excited to speak about that. But first, before diving into the topic of sulking and bliss, which I hope has been an intriguing title for people, I wanted to give a little background for people who may not know the work, may not have heard of it before, and also give a little more of a personal introduction to how I came to translate it, so that we can place the work both in its cultural context as well as in how it affected one person's life and why it might be able to touch other people's lives. 26 years ago, when I was just graduating from college, I received an extraordinary opportunity to live in South India for 2 years, to study the Tamil language, to teach English at a college, and also to explore other aspects of the culture, which in my case, I wanted to live in a village. I wanted to taste and experience for myself what a rooted, traditional, rural community can be like, and particularly how that relates to the way we relate to the earth beneath our feet, to the world, to the earth, to ecological questions and concerns. And I was extremely lucky to have found a wonderful teacher by the name of Dr. K.V. Ramakuri, who not only taught me to speak and understand spoken Tamil, but step by step gently led me into the written language, which can be quite different from the spoken language or spoken languages of the state of Tamil Nadu and beyond, but also took me into the extraordinary riches, literary riches of this language, which is in fact a living classical language. It has more than 2,500 years of unbroken literary tradition. And for a number of historical reasons has not been as widely known outside of India as, say, Sanskrit, largely because a whole generation of German Indiologists who were interested in studying India latched on to Sanskrit as a language of interest, and of course it is a very interesting language. But what people may not know is that Tamil is the other classical language of India, with really an extraordinary literary history. I thought to bring this story alive, I would share a few photographs. So if I can do this correctly, I should be able to bring up a couple pictures to show you. Here is me with right behind me is Dr. K.B. Ramakuri. This is a photograph taken in 1999, so almost 25 years ago, during what would have been the beginning of my second year of study of the language. To his left, to my teacher's left, or to our right, is his wife, K.R. Padmavati, and to his right, or to our left, his eldest daughter, Banu. And then I'm here with my parents, who had come to visit me halfway through my 2-year stint in India, my mother, Eileen, and my father, Glenn, on my sides. And I like to show this picture not only to give a glimpse of my teacher, and not only to give a glimpse of myself 25 years ago, but here we are in his home, where he had invited my parents to have a sumptuous meal. And he embodied, in practice, he and his wife together, whom I referred to as Amma, embodied the practices of hospitality, for instance, that are so beautifully spoken about and sung about in the Kural. Along with the house of my Tamil teacher, where I would go to study, I also lived in a village with another family which adopted me. This is my brothers, 3 of my brothers. The 4th of my adoptive brothers was taking the photograph, and there's my village mother and father, Amma and Appa. And this is in a small village outside the city of Madurai in the state of Tamil Nadu. And I lived there initially for the first year and a half of my stay, and then I've been connected with that village ever since. And to give a glimpse of the setting here, this is a village that was and is largely agricultural, and largely many of its fields depend on the skies for rain. So they grow crops like peanuts, for instance. And I took this picture of, this is my honorary family's, one of the fields they had, and I love the shape of the pile of peanuts. Another important crop in the village are jasmine flowers. Here is a similar heap of jasmine flowers on their way in the market to be sold to people who will take them and make them into various strings of jasmine flowers that go into people's hair, or adorned in puja rooms and other places like that. Now, to get from my teacher's house to the city of Madurai, where I was teaching, and then back to the village, I'd often ride the bus. And in the bus, from the very beginning of my stay, I would often see a plaque like this above the driver, and it would have a verse from a work called the Kural, or more simply, the Kural. And this is a work that I had known about for a long time. In fact, during my initial 2, actually it ended up being 2.5-year stay, I had a student who was very keen for me to come to his house for dinner. And finally our schedules aligned, and I went to his house, and I was given really an extraordinary feast, much more than I had been expecting. And as I was leaving, the father, my student's father, was very keen to give me 2 gifts. 2 books of poetry. One of them was a book of contemporary poetry by a Tamil poet. The other was this book, the Kural, which I remembered seeing verses in the city buses. And he looked at me very intently, and he said, "You study Tamil well, so that you can read this book, because this book has wisdom for every area of life in it." Of course, at the time, I had no idea that I would ever be able to read enough Tamil to read a book, which at the time seemed quite daunting to approach. But several years later, in 2003, 2004, I was able to return to Tamil Nadu, and in this time I was living with my Tamil teacher in his house and going back to the village on the weekends, and I was studying works of literature that had something to say about the relationship between people and place, between language and land. And one of the books I was very keen to read was the Kural, because the Kural is a book of both poetry and philosophy. And I was a philosophy major in college. I was particularly interested and remain interested, deeply interested in ethics. But the Tamil language had also opened my ear and my heart and mind to poetry, to what poetry can do, how poetry can touch us, how it can affect us and change our very sense of ourselves and of the world. And so I read the Kural with my Tamil teacher. I read all of the oldest commentaries to the work. The work was probably written somewhere between the 3rd to 5th centuries of the Common Era. Some people date it earlier than that. Some people might date it later, but that's roughly where my teacher would place it. I memorized some 600 or 700 of its 1,330 verses. I even learned to write in the verse form, which you can see in this photograph. It's a very short, it's not even 2 lines long. It's more like 1 5/8, if you want to imagine this sort of very short compact form with a longer first line and a shorter second line. But I had no intention of translating this work. And in the years since that study, when I would see my Tamil teacher in person or when I would speak with him on the phone, he would say things to me like, somebody really ought to do a proper literary translation of this work. And I'd say, yes, of course, it's a work of literature. It ought to be, we need a literary translation. And then he would say, and if someone were to read all of the old commentaries that you and I read and make a translation, that could be a wonderful thing. And I'd say, yes, I let someone come along and do it. I didn't realize, as I should have realized, that he was hinting that I might take on this task. Because one of the beautiful effects of Tamil in my life is that it reminded me of my own love of language, and it started me on my own apprenticeship to poetry and to writing more generally myself. And so during this whole time that I was studying the Tamil language, I was also becoming a writer and a poet myself. And it may seem strange that I didn't get my teacher's hint for a long time, except that he never had any qualms about saying if I should do something or if I shouldn't do something. He was always very direct, except with this one area, because I think he himself was a poet, and he knew that you can't ask someone to translate one of the most important works in all of Tamil literature. Either it will occur to somebody naturally or it won't, and the best you can do is hint, gently suggest. And 12 years later, I did get the hint, or rather that hint had planted the possibility for the idea to occur to me on its own. And it did. And then I went back to Tamil Nadu to work with my teacher in his, I'll show you, this is a more recent photo. This is from 2017, the year that I went back to go through the entire, I had a draft of the translation that I wanted him to look at, and we went through the entire work together. And then in 2022, the work was published by Beacon Press. As you can see, the publishers decided to describe the work as a new translation of the classical Tamil masterpiece on ethics, power, and love. And these 3 words refer to the 3 parts of the book: ethics, power, ethics at home, ethics in one's personal life. That's the first part of the book. The second part of the book is power or wealth or the wider world of community. So leadership, leaders, advisors to leaders, what does it mean to be a country, and so on. These are the concerns of the second part of the book. And then the third part of the book on love. Now, one of the things that I happened to mention in a previous talk that I gave for the King County Library System was that this third book on love has often been neglected. In fact, many of the earliest translations didn't even translate the third part of the book. It was seen as being, by some people who had more, what would be the word, more, who were more conservative, or some of these religious missionaries, they thought, oh, this third part of the book is too sensual, too earthy for their more abstract interest in, say, ethics or something like that. Even as late as the early 1998 or 1999, there was a new translation into English of the Kural. It was done in Hawaii, but it was only the first and the second parts of the book. So there's a long history of the third part of the book being downplayed or overlooked in a certain sense. Even students studying the work in contemporary Tamil Nadu, they'll learn different chapters from earlier parts of the book, and often the parts of the book on love are neglected. Now, I'd like to explore that. I'd like to explore that precisely because what the third part of the book is really about is in many ways more interesting than I think might appear on the surface. And also because there is an idea that the first and the second parts of the book are the parts that are really the most meaty, or the ones that have the most to say about embodying wisdom in everyday life. And the third part is about love, which is more fickle, which is more flighty, and maybe doesn't connect to the same kinds of ethical concerns. But one of the things I was surprised to discover in studying the work and then in translating it is that not only are some of the most delightful poems in the third part of the book, there is some extraordinarily profound wisdom in the third part of the book as well. Wisdom about the ways of our heart, the way our heart works in relatedness. And that's what I want to explore. Let me give a couple tastes, though, of the first and the second parts of the book for those who don't know it, so that you can have a kind of a beginning sense of how these different parts fit together. The book is composed of 133 chapters, each of these chapters on one topic. So there's a chapter on, say, the right time to do something, a chapter on the right place in which to do something. There's a chapter on hospitality, on generosity, on learning, on the art of listening, and so on. The second chapter of the book, which comes in the first part of the book on ethics, is on the glory of rain. And the 10th of the 10 verses in that section goes like this. No being can be without water. Nothing can flow for anyone without rain. I'll read it also in the Tamil, so you can, even if you don't understand the language, you can hear how it sounds. Neerin ramaya dulaganin yar yarkum vanin ramaya dorake. No being can be without water. Nothing can flow for anyone without rain. And here is a verse that takes our experience of the necessity of rain and of water for life, for all forms of life, and ties that to the necessity of rain for us to have things in our life flow. And this word for flow is also referring to the way we conduct ourselves in the world. We can't have free-flowing ethical conduct in the world if we don't yet have our lives, and we don't yet have the nourishment of rain, the nourishment of water. So that's a taste of the first part on ethics. Here's a taste of the second part. Here's a verse from the chapter on friendship, in which the poet Thiruvalluvar says, "Not presence, not birth, but feeling grants friendship its right." Here we're speaking about how it's not being in each other's presence all the time, or being born into the same place, and therefore being in close proximity, that gives friendship its the freedom that we feel to take liberties with each other, to be honest with each other, to know, he says, it's this feeling itself that grants the friendship its right, its sense of liberty. Here's how it sounds in Tamil. Punarchi paragadal venda. Unarchidan natpam kadamai tarum. Not presence, not birth, but feeling grants friendship its right. And I have a particular association with this verse because I always think of my Tamil teacher when I read this verse, because here was somebody who we certainly weren't always in each other's presence, and we certainly weren't born into the same language or country or civilization even. And yet we came to have a profound feeling of friendship in which he could take the liberty of suggesting to me ever so delicately that maybe somebody ought to translate this work in a literary way, in a way that could bring the poetry alive in English. So this third part of the book on love. This is not the love, it's not a book on, it's not a part of the book on sort of love in a kind of erotic sense, but rather love in the sense of a romantic play of archetypes. What does it mean to fall in love? What does it mean to be longing for the attention of somebody across a street, across a room? What is it to be in a committed, loving relationship and to know that your husband, your wife has to go away for a time, and for some legitimate purpose, to work, to serve, whatever it may be, but knowing what does it feel to anticipate that separation? What does it feel to long for the loved one to come back? So one way to think about the book on love is through a play of these archetypal figures: a young woman, a young man, the hero and heroine, the girlfriend of the heroine, and overhearing what the heroine says, and so on. All of these verses take on the embodying and acting the way our heart works in relatedness. These poems often also draw upon the extraordinary tradition in Tamil poetry from what's called the Sangam period. 2,000 or more years ago, there was a great flourishing of literature, wonderful poets, wonderful anthologies, writing about the world and writing about the ways of the heart, the exterior world and the interior world, in ways that remain to this day unparalleled. And all of the verses in the Kural draw on that older tradition of the Sangam poetry. So let's listen to some examples. The part of the book on love is divided into two sections traditionally. One is on the love before marriage, seeing someone, longing to be with someone. And then there's a section, the larger section of this part of the book, on committed relationships and what can happen in and with our hearts in those. So here is an example, a taste, if you will, from the part which can also be described as secret love, love that may be secret even to the young lovers. Here's a verse on knowing, perceiving what is happening. And all of the verses in this third part of the book, in contrast to the first and second parts of the book, are in the voice of these archetypal characters, in the young man's voice, for instance, or in the young woman's voice. And here's one in the young man's voice, and he says, "When I look, she looks at the ground. When I don't, she looks, smiling softly. Yan nokung kale nilan nokung, nokka kaldan noki mella nagum. When I look, she looks at the ground. When I don't, she looks, smiling softly." I can still remember my teacher teaching me this verse. Actually, this was even before we were studying the work as a whole together, because he used it as an example of what can happen in a poem. He said, "Do you notice anything a little odd about this poem?" And I said, "No, sir. I can see there he is, there she is. He looks at her, she looks down. He looks down, she looks at him. I could see the scene as if it were being played on a stage." And he smiled and he said, but if he says, when I don't look at her, she looks, smiling softly, and then I got it. if he's not looking at her, how does he know she's looking at him? And vice versa. And he said, this is what a poem can do. Unspoken, behind the words, we get to sense, there's more to this scene than we thought. There is the play of love and pretending not to look when we're looking. Sneaking a glance when we're not expecting to be sneaking a glance. And I've always remembered that lesson, which was not only about love, but about what a poet can do in a poem. Here are two poems now from the part of the book of love, or the section on love, having to do with committed relationships, marriage. One of them goes like this, and this is in the young wife's voice. And she says, do these bangles that slip from my wrists not say, this captain is sailing? Trevan turndamai tutrakol munkai irewa nindra valai. Do these bangles that slip from my wrists not say, this captain is sailing? The image is of this woman who she knows her husband has to go overseas for some work. She doesn't know it. He hasn't said anything, but her body knows it. And so her body starts to droop. Her weight starts to drop. Her bangles start to slip from her wrist in anticipation of the pain of separation. And there's a further interesting thing in this particular poem, because it draws on the earlier Sangam poetry that I mentioned, in which there is, in the interior world, there is also a connection to the landscapes of Tamil Nadu. And this is set in a harbor, or along the seaside, which traditionally in the Sangam poetry, the Sangam poetics, means it's the landscape of separation, or the anxiety of separation. Of this captain is sailing, or this husband of the harbor, this man of the harbor is sailing. And I love this poem because it reminds us the way that our body can know things. Maybe it's in a more fanciful language, and yet it can be true that our body can sense, anticipate things before maybe our minds have caught up with us, with our bodies. Here's another poem on longing, but this poem is of the wife who's waiting for her husband to come back, in the sort of archetypal view of it. And she's been waiting a long time. And she says, my eyes grow weak and lose luster. My fingers grow worn, numbering the days he's been gone. Varlatra purkendra kannum, avarasentra nalutri teinda viral. My eyes grow weak and lose luster. My fingers grow worn, numbering the days he's been gone. And it is one of the glories of this work that although we can interpret that poem in the way I've just described, young woman waiting for her husband to come back from having gone to work or gone to serve her country or something like that, we can also read the verse as being the longing we might feel for anyone who's had to leave, whether it's a lover or whether it's a husband or a wife or a best friend, a sibling, a cousin. There is an openness, because the poem is not about the situation primarily. The poem is primarily about what we feel, that feeling of longing. And so a poem like this can remind me, as I was translating it, of a folk song I learned growing up, which is in the voice not of the one who is still at home, but in the voice of the one who has left, who has gone on the road to work, for instance, but is longing to return. And I thought I would just share that song because it becomes, you can see how a work like this starts to have can have a dialogue across languages, across culture, and across time. The song goes like this. Perhaps you may have heard it. If you, let me just do one thing here. If you miss the train I'm on, you will know when I am gone. You can hear the whistle blow 100 miles. 100 miles, 100 miles, 100 miles, 100 miles. You can hear the whistle blow 100 miles. Not a shirt on my back, nor a penny to my name. Lord, I can't go home this away. This away, this away, this away, this away. Lord, I can't go home this away. Lord, I'm one, Lord, I'm two, Lord, I'm three, Lord, I'm four. Lord, I'm 500 miles away from home. Away from home, away from home, away from home, away from home. Lord, I'm 500 miles away from home. The longing, I think, is akin in that poem and in this song. And I think shows how great poetry and great song, which are, of course, deeply akin, can remind us of these essential human felt experiences. And all of this leads me to the part that I'm most excited to share with you and most excited to discuss with you in the Q&A that I look forward to us having. I remember when this translation was coming out and I was sharing it with friends, I shared it with an artist, a sculptor who was also a translator. And he had never heard of heard about this particular work, and he read it with great interest. And he said, this is an amazing work. It touches on so many things, on leadership, on farming, on having children, on what does it mean to be truly generous, and so on. I thought, where is this poet going to end? And so he was initially a little puzzled when he discovered that the work ends at the end of the part 3 on love with not 1, not 2, but 3 chapters on sulking. And he said, why is that? And I said, that is a wonderful question. Because these chapters on sulking, I think, are where we see how simultaneously playful and profound this work and the poet Tiruvalluvar can be. Because what is this sulking? This sulking is about what happens in any committed relationship that endures, which is that we're in our relationship, we're in our relatedness. And inevitably there'll be misunderstandings, mistaken interpretations, misperceptions of what's going on, and one of us will turn away and sulk in a corner somewhere. But the wonderful thing about sulking, the poet Tiruvalluvar reminds us, is that this becomes an opportunity to turn back anew, to take a look at what happened. What did I say? What did the other person really say? And to have the courage to see each other more fully and to grow through this process even closer. And with that in mind, in the first of the book, chapters on sulking, there's this wonderful little verse that reminds us or tells us sulking is like salt. A little much is too much. Upamaindatral pulavi, அது சிறிது மிக்கற்றால் நீள விடல். Sulking is like salt. A little much is too much. And just as with that earlier poem, the unspoken lesson, the unspoken insight is that just as our food without that right amount of salt will be bland, just as that perfect amount of salt will allow all of the flavors to come alive in our mouths and in our experience, so too the right amount of sulking, the right amount of turning away and coming back again, is part of the process by which we refine our relatedness. It's like two stones that rub up against each other and they rub off each other's rough edges. There's a kind of essential necessity to this sulking, even as it may be deeply uncomfortable. And I think it is with that discomfort in mind that the second of the chapters on sulking deals with what Theravada calls sulking's subtleties. And the ways, the nitty-gritty in and outs, the ways that we can misunderstand each other. So here are just a couple tastes. One is in the voice of the young husband, let us say. And he says, I remembered you, I said, and she pulled back. So you forgot? And the joke is that because to remember somebody, you have to not be thinking about it and you recall their memory. You bring their memory back to mind. It means, oh, he wasn't thinking about her 24/7. And you can see, both the playfulness there and how subtle the ways that we sulk may be. I'll read it again. I remembered you, I said, and she pulled back. So you forgot? And from there it goes to this one, which plays with the idea that when somebody sneezes, it's because somebody else is thinking about them. Again, in the voice of the young man, the young husband. I sneezed and she blessed me, then wept, saying, who made you sneeze? Now, part of the joke here is that since she's sulking, she's not talking to him. And so he wants to remedy this. He wants to reconnect. And so he sneezes and success. She blesses him. She's spoken. But what does that lead to? It leads to her saying, somebody else was thinking about you. Who could she be? I sneezed and she blessed me, then wept, saying, who made you sneeze? Which is followed immediately by this verse. I held back a sneeze and she wept, saying, whose thought do you hide? And here the great medieval commentator Palimer Alagar says, if I sneeze, she gets mad. If I don't sneeze, she gets mad. What am I to do? And it captures the conundrum, the way it can feel when in our relationships we get jangled. We get the sense of, I can't, there's no way to break out of certain dynamics, certain forms of sulking. But why do we do it? Well, this is why there's one more chapter on sulking, entitled Sulking and Bliss. And the third of these 10 poems in that chapter says this. Hearts joined like earth and water. What heaven transcends their sulking? Pulittalin puttir nadundo, nilittoda neer iendandrar agatte. Hearts joined like earth and water. What heaven transcends their sulking? The image here is how water and earth join and intermingle so that we can't tell where one ends and the other begins. When people are in it like that, are together like that, What heaven transcends their sulking, he says, precisely because of this understanding that it's through sulking that we become truly together. We become humbled in our perceptions and more fully awake to each other. And I love this poem also because it refers back, I think, to the poem I mentioned in the book, in the chapter on rain, where Tiruvalluvar talks about, no being can be without water. Nothing can flow for anyone without rain, because that flowing is like the flowing of water through land, like a great river, where the water and the river, the water and the land that make the river are so deeply connected, and they're always affecting each other. And that good conduct can be as natural as a river flowing, and hearts can also be joined in such a way as water and land connect. And one more poem before we have a little time for Q&A. It's the last of all the poems in the Kural, verse 1330, in which Tiruvalluvar says this: sulking in love is joy, and joining again joy of joys. Kural kamathirkinbam, adarkinbam kudi muyanga perin. Sulking in love is joy, and joining again joy of joys. Here too we can see the understanding that the point of sulking is not the sulking. The point of sulking is that we join anew. We reconnect more deeply, more fully, in a more heartfelt way. And I'll just have one side note about this last poem. In Tamil, the verse ends with the sound in, which is the last letter in the Tamil alphabet. Just as the first verse of the Kural begins with the sound a, the sound of the first letter in the Tamil alphabet. And so, even though joys is written with S, it has the sound of Z, joy of joys. And so that's one of the ways I've tried to do a small poetic nod toward the genius of Tiruvalluvar and how he has arranged these verses. So that is what I wanted to share with you about sulking and bliss, and some of the ways of the heart in relatedness that Tiruvalluvar speaks about in very playful, but I also think very profound ways. And so what I'd like to do with the time that remains is to ask if anybody has any questions they would like to share, and I'll do my best to respond to those. I imagine we could either have people unmute and speak their questions with or without the video camera, depending on their level of comfort, or put them into the chat. Either way would be fine with me.
Well, I have a question, if that's okay.
Yes, please, certainly.
I read a lot of translated literature myself, and yet I only speak English. I only speak one language. And I'm really curious if you could give us some insight into what it's like when you are translating, especially something that is poetic in a sense, how you can translate something from a language that is so different than English, like you were saying, has a different alphabet, things like that, and how do you feel you do justice to the original text? And because I know translation itself is an art, so I would just be curious to hear more about what you think about it and what your experience has been.
Sure, thank you. That's a wonderful question. For me, one of the most important things, and really one of the only reasons that I dare attempt to do the translation, aside from my teacher's encouragement, was to try to do some kind of justice to the poetic qualities that make the book so alive in Tamil. I think although it is one of the most translated books from the language, and in fact it's one of the most translated books in the world, I've often asked myself, why is it that it is not very well known yet in the English-speaking world? And I think at least part of the answer is that most of the translations that have appeared have treated the verses as ideas or been interested in their ideas, which of course are important. But when they translate them in a way which leaves out rhythm, which leaves out the sounds of the words, leaves out the playfulness that the poet Tiruvallur has with language, all of which are qualities which make the poems in Tamil. And so my primary aim was to capture something of the poetry. Now, of course, as you rightfully note, these are very different languages. They have very different poetic traditions. So how can you even do that? Here's my nutshell thinking on this, is that although you can never do the same thing in the same way in another language, you can do something similar in a similar way. So I'll give you an example. I've said very few of the translations have attempted to convey these poetic qualities. One that did decided to try to make everything end with rhyming words. So just like we have, I was trying to think of some silly, so just, writing with like ball and wall at the ends of the poetic lines, something like that. And so they tried that, and they convoluted their sentences to make them work, neglecting the fact that none of the poems in the Kural have that form of rhyme in them at all. The poems of the Kural instead have a very intricate form of internal rhyme, meaning that there are consonant sounds that rhyme with each other. There are vowel sounds that rhyme across the lines. There are initial consonant and vowel sounds that rhyme with each other. And so as a translator and as a poet in English, my principle became, what can I do in English whereby even in the English version you have rhyming vowel sounds and rhyming consonant sounds, which, interestingly enough, takes us back to the roots of English poetry in Anglo-Saxon, where the principle there too wasn't rhyming words at the ends of lines, but rather rhyming vowel sounds and rhyming consonant sounds. I'll give you one example. There is a verse, if I can pull it up quickly enough. There is a verse which I'll read it first in Tamil. Payan tookkar செய்த உதவி நயன் தூக்கன் நன்மை கடலிற் பெரிது. And here, even if you don't know the Tamil language at all, you can hear that there's tukkar and tukin, these two very similar sounding words. It happens to be a verb conjugated in two different ways. And there's also several words that begin with the sound na, or nayan, nanmai. And so, although I can't make the exact same words do the same thing with the same vowels and consonants, I can, at least in a translation, try to emulate that. And so what I've done is this: the weight of good done without weighing results, grace greater than oceans. So here we have, to mimic the play of tukar and tukin, we have weight and weighing. And then to mimic the sound of nayan and nanmai, we have grace and greater. Of course, in English they're spelled slightly differently, but if you listen, you hear the same initial consonant and vowel sounds: grace, greater. So that's one of the ways that I've tried to emulate and suggest some of the delightful sonic qualities of Tamil poetry, along with some rhythmic elements and other things like that. So I hope that's a beginning of a satisfactory answer.
Yes, that was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. What else? There is another poem I thought of sharing, which comes from even earlier than the Kural. You'll remember the second to last Kural verse I shared about hearts joined like earth and water. I think when people read that verse or hear that verse, they may, in the original context, they may think also of one of the beautiful and perhaps most famous of the Sangam love poems. And in fact, as part of my translation, I made a commentary giving sort of further insight into particular words and phrases. And I also included this poem from the Sangam era, which is a beautiful love poem which draws in the same kind of imagery. So I thought I would share that as well. The poem goes like this. Who is your mother to mine? How is my father related to yours? How did we know one another? Like rainfall and red earth, our hearts themselves came together. And here we have two people. Archetypally, we think of a man and a woman, a young man and a young woman, but it doesn't specify in the poem. It can be any two people who are meeting, who are coming where their parents don't know each other, their mothers, their fathers have no relationship, so they have no previous connection. And yet they meet, and in that meeting, their hearts come together. How? Like rainfall and red earth. Like how those come together and become inseparable, mingled. So that same image is there. I'll read the poem one more time because I think it is such a beautiful poem. And in fact, the poet is known by that line. We could translate the poet's name as simply honored of rainfall and red earth. And this is his poem. Who is your mother to mine? How is my father related to yours? How did we know one another? Like rainfall and red earth, our hearts themselves came together. We have maybe time for one more question if anybody happens to have a question.
There was something put in the chat.
Mm-hmm. I hear here, I'll just read it out. I just wanted to say I love to hear you talk about the Kural, and if you could share other verses that have spoken deeply to you, it would be wonderful. Well, I think that's a wonderful way to end our time together. So many verses have spoken to me. I'll share one in particular. And it's a verse that takes a new meaning even today itself. It is a verse about, it's from a chapter early on in the work called Having Love. And I'll read the verse and I'll tell you why it's meaningful to me today. The verse says, is there a latch for love? The fullness of our hearts show in the tears that well. Anbirkumundo arikumtar, arabalar punkanir pusultarum. Is there a latch for love? The fullness of one's heart shows in the tears that well. And I love this verse for its reminder that when we part from a loved one and tears rise up, that those tears, however sorrowful, are also a sign of fullness, a sign of how we have loved, how we have lived with each other in a loving way. And those mean a lot to me today, because earlier today, my husband and I were at the burial of a dear friend and mentor of ours. And of course, in that ceremony, there were tears. And I had given him actually a copy. Actually, he had honored me several months ago by purchasing a copy of the translation, but I had signed it for him more recently. And I had written that particular verse because of the conversation we were having. And then I got to experience that again this afternoon as people were shedding tears and grieving the loss of this loved one. And all of these tears being a sign of the overflowing fullness of the love that we continue to share, which I think is a beautiful reminder. And I think that these verses, one of the ways that they serve us and they serve the world is precisely as these reminders that we can carry with us, that widen our perception, that remind us of things that we know to be true. So I'm very grateful that all of you joined me today, whether you're joining in the Zoom meeting itself or watching the recording afterwards. And I also, one last thing is, if this is interesting to you, especially if you are encountering the Kural for the first time, I'm going to be doing a talk next month on the Kural and mental health at the request of somebody from the Tamil community in Virginia, where I was speaking earlier this summer. And so if you're interested in that kind of topic, I invite you to visit my website, thomaspruiksma.com. You can sign up for my newsletter, and I'll be posting something about that shortly. So, and I've also dropped that in the chat, so you can see that there. So thank you, and thank you, Julie, very much for hosting us.
Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a great rest of your evening, and I am now officially going to stop the recording. See if I can do that without ending the meeting. There we go.